Chapter 29. Nothing makes time go slower than waiting. And we were waiting for so many things. Waiting for Uncle to come home, for the war to end, and now, worst of all, waiting to hear what would happen to Tayul. The first few days were terrible. Every time I heard a car outside, I was sure it would stop at our house, that it was the army coming to tell us, what, that Tayul was in jail? Or the other, which I couldn't even say to myself. A few days passed, then a week. Sometimes I thought I was losing my mind, that if we didn't learn something soon, I wouldn't be able to bear it. But if I couldn't bear it, what would I do? March into the military headquarters and demand an answer? Take a train and boat to Japan and find out myself? I thought about asking Tomo. His father was an important education official. Perhaps he could find out something. In the end, I did none of those things. I stared at my diary for hours at a time and wrote what I could, which was only a few words. Uncertainty, a flower. Dying for want of rain. The nearest cloud, a world away. The weeks slowly grew into a month. It was full summer now, and so hot I always felt dirty. Sweat making everything sticky. I found myself wishing I could take off every stitch of clothing and go around the way babies did. I walked home from school, trying not to drag my feet. I was hot and tired, but if I dragged my feet, I'd kick up clouds of dust and get even dirtier. I rounded the corner and heard a loud noise. It took me a moment to realize that the noise was the voice of someone screaming. I raised my head and froze in mid-step. It was my mother's voice. It was Amoni who was screaming. I ran so fast I nearly crashed into a soldier who was coming out of our gate. I stepped aside, frantic and panting, as he was followed by an officer in a smart uniform and two more soldiers. When they'd passed me, I'd ran the last few steps to the door. Amoni was standing in the doorway. She was holding her hands wide open in front of her, staring at the ground at her feet and screaming. "Amoni," I said, trying to make myself heard. It was no use. It was as if some kind of evil spirit had possessed her. She could only look up at me, wild-eyed, and then down at her feet, still screaming. I looked down, too, and saw what was on the ground. A box, open where it had fallen, a sword wrapped in a cloth, and an envelope. I knew about these things. They'd been delivered before to other households in the neighborhood, delivered by the army to the family of a dead soldier. A soldier who had died an honorable death, not one who'd been executed for treason. Our plan had failed, mine and Ebjui's. Either the authorities hadn't believed him or the message hadn't gotten through. Tayul had flown his mission. My heart seemed to stop beating. My movements as I bent over to pick up the envelope were stiff and jerky. It had fallen face down, and I turned it over in slow motion. The handwriting was Tayul's, so the words on the envelope, "To the family of the late Kaineyamo Nabuo," didn't make sense. In fact, I had to read them twice, and still they didn't make sense. I managed to drag Amoni inside. When I gripped her arm firmly, she seemed to come to herself a little, and she seemed to stop screaming. She let me lead her into the sitting room. I helped her sit down and hurried to make her some tea. As long as I kept busy, I wouldn't have to think about what the words in the envelope meant. The news must have reached Ebjui, for now he came home then, much earlier than usual. I put the envelope on the shelf in the kitchen. Hastily, I stepped into the courtyard and handed it to him. He opened it and read the letter right there where he stood. Then he closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, I couldn't look at him. I followed him into the sitting room. He touched Amoni on the shoulder but said nothing. There was no need. She didn't respond at all, her face the color of ashes and her body still as stone. Then Ebjui turned to me. He tried to speak but couldn't. Instead, he handed me the letter. My hand shook so hard that the paper rattled. I tightened my fingers on the edges to stop their trembling so I could read. "My dear family, I am free to write whatever I wish in this letter, and I've been promised that it will not be censored. So I begin by telling you that tomorrow morning I will take part in a special attack unit mission. I am a member of the Kamikaze, the Divine Wind Pilot Corps." I'd guessed right, but felt no satisfaction. I felt nothing at all, but I kept reading. You may wonder how this came about. It will not be easy to explain, but you're owed my best effort. At training camp in Seoul, the officers were debating whether or not to ask for Korean volunteers for a special assignment. It seemed there was a question about our bravery. Some officers did not believe that Korean men possessed enough courage to volunteer for this kind of mission. I could not let such an insult go unchallenged. I told our commanding officer that I would volunteer for any mission, no matter how dangerous. It turned out, of course, that they were seeking volunteers for the kamikaze. Perhaps it sounds foolish in telling of it, but I can assure you that my decision had the desired effect. The officers were impressed and began to treat me, not me, but all of the Korean recruits with more respect. To be honest, we are all not as well prepared as I would wish. Our training was limited because of the lack of fuel and suitable equipment. You've heard of the unit's spectacular successes, but there have been many failures as well. However, I have flown a plane several times now and am confident that I'll be able to do my best when the time comes. I wish for each of you the chance to ride in a plane someday. It's a thrilling and humbling experience to view the earth from above. At a time like this, it's not possible to write down everything that's in my mind, but there's one thing I wished my beloved parents to know. I'm not in this position because of uncontrolled fate or misfortune. It was my choice to volunteer, and I realize that in doing so, I'll be leaving you without a son on this earth. I'm ashamed of my decision only because of this knowledge and the pain it will cause you. Were it not for that, I would go into tomorrow's mission with my heart free. I will close this letter with a story from my sister, who so loves stories. The Japanese pilots wear special belts when they fly. These belts are made for them by the women and their families and have a special name. They are called senabari, 1,000 stitches. When a Japanese woman makes such a belt, she stands in the street with it and asks passerby to put in a stitch to wish her son or brother well as they do so. After 1,000 people have put in one stitch, the belt is complete. The Japanese pilots believe that these belts help protect them from misfortune because they carry the good wishes of 1,000 people. It's a nice story, but I have no need of such a belt. When I fly tomorrow, it will be with the assistance of my family's love, and this alone will give me the strength to do what is necessary. My last gift to you all is the knowledge that I have chosen the way of my death, which is something few of us are privileged to do. Your son and brother, Kim Tae-yul. The letter was dated the 19th of June. That meant Tae-yul died on the 20th, almost 2 weeks ago. What had I been doing then? I refolded the letter automatically and put it back in the envelope as I tried to recall that day. I'd been at school. Had it been sandbagging or bayonet practice? As long as I concentrated on trying to remember, I wouldn't have to think about Tae-yul. We had no proper cloths for mourning, but the next day, Amoni was wearing a white mourning dress. I learned later that it belonged to Mrs. An. She had worn it in secret at the time of her mother's passing and kept it hidden from the Japanese. Amoni did not have to worry about this because the Japanese grudgingly respected those families who had lost someone to the war effort. She drifted about the rooms like a pale ghost. Our grief was too deep for tears. There wasn't even a body for us to grieve over. It was somewhere at the bottom of the sea. After we received that letter, the hours, the light and dark of day and night drifted without any meaning. I went about my chores, thinking only about what I was doing. This seemed the easiest way to get through the day, by talking to myself in my mind. Let's see, we need bowls now. 5 bowls, 1 for millet, 1 for beans, 3 eating bowls. Reach up to the shelf, get down the bowls. Oops, that's only 4, you need 1 more. I knew I was like a crazy person talking to myself like that. I didn't care, because most of the time it worked. It drowned out my thoughts of Tae-yul. But the knowledge of his death was like a terrible beast that lurked in odd corners of the house. In a cupboard behind a door, I'd be going along fine, and suddenly the fact would leap out at me, roaring, drowning out my own voice in my head. Your brother is dead, dead, dead. He'll never come back. You'll never talk to him or see him again as long as you live. And I'd stop moving and stand with my eyes squeezed shut, trembling, scarcely breathing. When the roaring stopped, I'd open my eyes, dazed. Once Amoni found me in the garden where I'd been hanging laundry. I'd frozen like that, a damp sheet in my hands, for so long that my fingers were wrinkled from the wetness. But one afternoon in the middle of August, I had to rouse myself from my dazed grief for a neighbor accounting. I fetched Mrs. An and stood in line with her. I alone was representing my family. Abjui was at work, and Amoni was still in morning dress, which meant that she shouldn't be seen in public. I knew right away that something unusual was happening because the block leader didn't ask to count off. He simply waited until enough people had gathered, then made his announcement, not in Japanese, in Korean. The war was over. The emperor had surrendered to the United States. Korea was free. There was a brief silence, then someone shouted. Suddenly, everyone around me was shouting, throwing their arms in the air, hugging one another, laughing, crying. A man grabbed the megaphone and began singing in Korean. Most of the crowd joined in. People who'd not been at the accounting came out of their houses to find out what was going on and quickly joined in the Rashka celebration. In the midst of that joyous commotion, I stayed quiet and felt my body begin to shake. My stomach heaved. I put my fist to my mouth and pressed hard. Less than 2 months, a war that had lasted for years, and Tayul had died less than 2 months before it ended. I wanted to throw back my head and howl like an animal. Instead, my legs gave way and I sat down hard right there in the street. And it was old Mrs. An who helped me to my feet and led me home.